plenty of people for this session. Hopefully we can make this room a little bit warmer, breathe in here all together, because it's kind of freezing cold. And today we're going to speak about one of the most common problems for front-end, the state management. Before I start, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Natalia, and I'm a core team member of Vue.js framework. I care mostly about writing Vue.js documentation. So if you read Vue docs, you're reading something I probably touched. I'm sorry for that. And if you're using Vue.js or used Vue.js or whatever, like touched Vue.js, please raise your hand so I can see. Yay! Wow, that's nice to see so many people touching Vue. I work as principal engineer at GitLab, and we use Vue every day, so it's a nice combination. And I was quite surprised when I arrived to the conference and apparently found GitLab booth over there. I swear, I didn't know we are here. And this talk is nothing about GitLab. And I'm also a Google developer expert in web technologies. So let's start with a very common statement I think we can all agree on. State management is complicated. Even if it starts small and simple, it will become complicated. And the bigger it grows, the more complicated it is. And I will be using an example today. It will be using Vue and Vue State Manager Pinia. But if you don't use Vue, like this half of the audience, don't worry. The code is pretty straightforward, and the solution I will be using here is also framework agnostic. So don't focus on this. So let's start with the simplest example, so you just get familiar with the syntax of Pinia if you never used it. And here we just defining the store, where we have one property counter, really simple, right? And then we want to do something with this counter with very simple action, increment. This is the most simple example, and of course it's not real. Not a real application uses this. It's very specific because here we use synchronous way of getting the data. This state is not persistent. Whenever you refresh a page, your counter drops back to 0. It has one source of changes. It's our client. So whenever you just increment something, clicking a button, you have the state changes. And it does not create a lot of boilerplate. Debatable, but it's still pretty simple, short code we are using there. However, real applications are not built like this. And then, real application involves server data. We are doing an API request. And here where things go curiouser and curiouser. Let's take an example that is closer to real life, and let's just discover how our state management evolves there. So there is an app with the characters of Alice in Wonderland. And there is a counter of these characters in the top navbar. So we have two places where we want to access the shared state, the list of characters. Let's presume that these two states are completely independent. Maybe I don't have a counter. Maybe I have a feature flag that should just disable the navbar altogether. Or maybe I just go to the next page and I still want the list of the characters to be accessed by the navbar. Let's, again, presume that they are completely independent and we're not doing the fetching in the root component, which sounds obvious in this particular case. So we need some kind of a shared state between the two. It still looks simple. Nothing different from the counter. Okay, let's start. But of course, this example is already a little bit complicated. Because as any good developer, you want to track the login state for your asynchronous request. And as a good developer, you also want to handle errors. Because you're not leaving the catch block empty, do you? Hope not. I've seen this in the code base. So already 3 properties instead of 1. Fine. Let's just fetch our characters. And this is the code really familiar to anyone who built any kind of crude loading to true, fetching data, if everything good, populating the characters, if something is wrong, populating error, loading to false. Fine. Then we want to use this fetching in 2 independent components, because again, we assume that They can be existing without each other. And we're not doing it in the root because maybe we don't need in the root. Maybe our counter is disabled, right? And we are on the standalone character page. So okay, both components, fetch data. We just add this code to both components, fetch characters, and obviously we have this cool result. Well, we fetch it twice, obviously. Can we do something with it besides moving to root component? Oh, well, we're developers. We can add conditions and duplicate requests. So we write this really, really bad getter, which says, okay, if there are characters already, or if there is a loading right now, do not fetch. So first request triggers loading. Second one is like, okay, there is loading state. We're not running. Fine, that's did the job. One request, cool. Now, we also want to populate this state with more details for a single character. If I go to the character page, I have more properties in this object. I also want to add occupation, address, and some description. And I want to populate my array, because why not? Why do I need to store it separately somewhere like active character or something? Cool. Let's go and add these 3 properties to our array. Sounds easy. This is kind of a very basic and very shitty code. Again, does the job, but here I want to fetch a character. And if there is already an array, so if we went first to the comment page, I just want to extend one object of this array with 3 properties. And still handling error and loading. And of course, I also need to handle fetch characters differently. Imagine if I go to the character page, a single one, with a deep link, and then to the main page. I don't want to lose my data about the character, right? I have these 3 properties. They are very precious to me. Okay, now we also go and check if there is a character already. We also want to keep this character and only add all the other characters to the array. And it becomes complicated. But it works, right? It should work. Nope. You remember the getter we had? Checking the length. Here it goes, very lonely Alice, because we have this state character length, more than 0, but now we have 1 character already fetched. Okay, fine, we just fix this. And you go like this, and the more data you add to this store, the more you want to extend and keep everything, the more complicated it becomes. With more data, you need to handle more edge cases, more loading states, more error states too. And if you want to get somewhere, you must run as least twice as fast. And it brings us a bunch of problems. How to fetch only when data is not fetched? How to keep it up to date? In this current example, we fetch once, and then we check the character's length, which means it never, ever, ever is going to be updated. And then we involve things like polling or WebSockets or something else. What if 2 components start fetching simultaneously? They duplicate. What if 5 components start fetching simultaneously? What if they are fetching some partial data? It's all problematic. And here we're dealing with a common problem that not all states are born equal. There is a local state, and there is a server cache. And these 2 kind of states are very different in your application. And maybe trying to use the same solution for both is not such a good idea. For server cache, I think first came across a good solution when we started using Apollo client. And Apollo client is cool. It will handle most of the server cache problems with you caching data, handling loading, handling errors. Besides, there is one problem. It's designed to work with GraphQL. If you have GraphQL, cool. If you don't, well, Apollo can handle REST API requests. If you write a bunch of resolvers, then the boilerplate will be even worse than the one I just shown you. So, Instead, there is a cool solution that actually came from React world. It hurts to say this as a Vue developer, but it's true. But now it has wrappers for multiple frameworks, including Vue. That's why I'm using Vue Query. And instead of explaining how Vue Query works and reading documentation to you, let's just code the same application we've seen on the screen with Vue Query. So let's jump into the live coding. For now, we have this very empty app. It fetches nothing and the code. And disclaimer, I do not use light theme normally, okay? It's very light here, so my normal dark theme would be unreadable. So let's go for it. Guys and girls on the last rows, is it readable for you? Okay, good. So, for those of you who don't work with Vue, this is typical Vue syntax where ref creates a reactive object with one property value. Just a quick explanation like what the ref is. And instead, we will be using Vue Query. Syntax for Vue and React for Vue Query is very similar. They both use the same thing, which in React would be a hook. In Vue, it would be called composable, but visually, it's still the same. So let's start fetching our data. And we immediately will alias the data as characters. And here is the first piece of a magic. We are using use query from Vue Query. And here we will give it a key, a name under which the data will be stored in Vue Query cache. We don't need it for now, but just remember that this cryptic string in the array is the key of our query. We will use it later. And the second parameter here is the function that will actually fetch the data, a promise. I have it already here, and if you wonder what it is, just an Axios call to my local server. Nothing more. So no magic here. And of course, I need to remove this because Vue is already complaining that I have the same property defined twice. Everything we define in this block script setup is already available in the template. So let's go to our page. Nothing is still available here. And you can see that here in Vue DevTools, there is characters fetched. So the call happened on the background. You can see it here. But we are not seeing any kind of characters on the screen. Why? Well, this is REST API. And when we fetch data, we have this normal object with data, status, and everything, and we only want data. This is the array we want to display. Again, with Vue, normally I would try the computed property that just retrieves the data from the characters. But with Vue Query, we have a better option. We can just pass select, and we pass the function that will actually retrieve the data from there. Okay, now we got the characters over here. Cool, just fetching the data, nothing fancy yet, almost Axios. Good thing that we don't need to handle loading and error too, because you can just simply return them from the query. The composable is already handling this case for us. So is loading, is error, is here. And let's make an error in our API to see this in action. So you see there is loading, and I'll just refresh the page so you will see that by default, React query and Vue query will retry 3 times before throwing an error, which I think is a bit excessive, like 3 retries. I trust my backend, so not really, but let's limit it to 1 retry because it's long waiting time for the user to just observe this annoying loading indicator. Now better? Yep, now it's 1 retry. One more thing that is here by default is whenever you change the focus, it refetches, which is good for an application if you want a user for example, be inactive for some time, maybe switching to a different tab, then coming back, and here is your fresh data if you want it. I don't really want it. I don't like this, so I'm just disabling this refetch on window focus. False. Now we have some little part of the query, configured one. I want to use it in the navbar too. I could copy paste, but why not using the power of Vue framework? I mean, I'm core team, I'm kind of obliged to promote it. So let's also build some little reusable part of the logic and call it, I don't know, use API JS. Here I will just copy paste whatever we have to the new function called use characters. Maybe we will have more, so characters. And let's just get all the things from home, like this, and copy them to API. Of course, I will need to use imports out of here, and I need to return everything to use this in the component. So I want to return characters, I want to return loading, and error. And in the component, I'm deleting all of this, including ref. I want to just import my use characters. Wow, this time auto import decided to work. When I'm doing dry runs, it's like, no, I'm not importing. Shouldn't be lazy, just import yourself. So let's just have our properties here, and then we do the same in the navbar. Characters, please is loading, and is error. And this is return from use characters. Okay, did we break anything? Yeah, we did broken API. This was intentional. Okay, fine. It's still working. Good. Now we do the same thing in the navbar, and it should just work. Which it won't, of course, but let's see. So we have characters. We don't need loading and error. We don't show them in the navbar. And we think everything's fine. It looks good. And we have total 8 in the navbar. Try to refresh the page. Oops. What happened here? Let's see. So here you can see that we are accessing characters length. But characters is the data we return from use query, right? And before our API request is resolved, it's undefined. So it's trying to take a length of undefined. How can we do this? Create another reactive property? Well, we can, but overriding it and removing is weird. So instead, we just use the same cool thing about your query. It's called placeholder data. And this is the thing that will be shown before the request is resolved. Important thing, it should be the same shape of the data that you are selecting from here. So if you put an empty array, it won't work because it's trying to get res data, and res is array. So instead it will be an object with data property, which is an empty array. And now it's good. Now it's populating data properly. Still, we didn't come to caching yet. So if I go to my page, I just basically build, oh my god, this microphone. I basically build the client, but not a state manager yet. So let's go to the network, and if I go to this tab and back, we're fetching characters. Back, we're still fetching characters, so there is no state shared yet. By default, React and Vue query will treat all your data as stale. So if anything is fetched, it's already stale, and it should be refetched every single time you remount the component or do basically anything. So here is the most important thing you should take from this talk if you're taking anything, is called stale time. Here you define for how long you want your query to keep the data in the cache. For now, I say, okay, unrealistic 5 seconds. In real life, it will be probably up to 5 minutes. But for now, let's just see if it works. So I go and back, and we're not refetching now. 5 seconds passed, and there is a new refetch. Of course, you can modify it for different queries. You can set it up globally too. So if you want to keep all your data for like 10 minutes, it can be set on the client level. Now let's continue with fetching a single character to see how we work with parameters too. Because that's a bit different when you want to store data with a parameter in the cache. So here we are fetching a single character. I will just remove these refs and say that data character and is loading are a result of using query. We're not using our composable here, it's the list of the characters. And here we want to use the same key we already had for characters, but in addition to this, we also need an ID of the character. And we have this props. This ID comes from the router. That's what we show in the URL. So instead of just characters, it will be also props ID. So for example, for Alice, it's 1. And the fetching function is a callback here, not just passing a function, because we need to pass a parameter. So it will be get character, again, just an Axios call, where we pass the same props ID. And you remember about the REST API, so I'm just putting select right here, REST data. And I also want to keep the character for at least 10 seconds. Okay, good, let's see. Let's go to the cat, back, and we're not refetching neither characters nor a cat. 5-second pass, so characters refetched, but the cat is still here. So now we come to the final part, which is cool. You store everything in the cache. What about changing it? What about modifying the cache? If I want to add a new character, we can do it too. So I have this handy note, so I'm not typing a new character. And I will just try to add a new character over here. So we have a new character, the caterpillar, my favorite one from Alice. And we want to add some button to edit. So there is a button, add new character. And here we want to call another API call, a post. And very similar to Apollo client. I think that's where React query initially got the inspiration. They name get request queries and post put whatever modifying request mutations. So here we will be using mutation, and mutation returns us a method we need to call. It's mutate by default, and I will just alias it is add new character. So we are using mutation, and here we don't need to pass any kind of the key. We just pass in a callback saying add character. And we want to pass new character here. Again, new add character is just a post request here we're sending. So now I just want to use this in my template on button click. So on click, add new character. Okay, let's go and see how this works. So here is a network tab. Let's click. And there is a post request. It's successful. We actually added a caterpillar, but obviously the UI didn't change because data is cached and we didn't touch the cache in any possible way. And here are two main ways of dealing with things. If you're like, I don't really care about any performance of my backend or any load, you can just say invalidate query characters. This will trigger the client to just refetch it. But it's not fun, and also backend will complain about the load, like why you're fetching things all the time. So you can also modify the cache. So let's refresh the page and see if caterpillar is here. It is. And now we just need to reflect the same kind of change right to the cache. I will need a client instance for this. So const client is use query client. And I also need to change an ID, because I have a strict backend will complain that non-unique ID if I try it like this. And what I want to do, if mutation is successful, on success. I want to add this to my array of characters. And of course, I have a response here too. So on success, we say client set query data. And now we need the key of the query. We want to modify the characters in the cache. Characters. And data will be an array where we have our characters value. This cryptic value is here because we're dealing with view refs, and view ref is an object with value property. If you use it in a template, you don't need to unpack it, but here it's characters value. And we also want to add res data, so the response of our mutation to the same array. Okay, now the moment of truth. Yep, now we have 2 caterpillars, which is just enough. And you can see how the cache works with your query. Of course, it's much more powerful than that. You can set up polling to refresh your data. You can use infinite queries for pagination. You can do pretty much everything you want. You can even set up it to work with WebSockets, not built in. You will need to connect them yourself. You can invalidate cache in any possible way. You can invalidate it over time. You can invalidate it manually and refetch things. It's very, very, very powerful tool, which can be used in combination with your old good state manager, because it wasn't designed to replace everything like Apollo was, like jack of all trades. So you can use both in your application, separating server cache and local state. And I hope this talk gave you at least a little of inspiration to try it and see if it works for you. And thank you.